The first shot came before anyone had finished their coffee. That was the thing about the range at Camp Lejeune. It didn't care what time it was, didn't care that the fog was still sitting low on the tree line, or that half the platoon had just rolled off a 14-hour flight from Ramstein. The range opened at Zo 530, and Staff Sergeant Lena Cross was already there, kneeling in the gravel, running a bore brush through the barrel of her M110 like she'd been awake for hours. Because she had been. She did that. The other guys on the team had figured that out by the third week. Whenever there was a range day scheduled, Cross showed up before the range officer, before the brass, before the coffee was even hot in the break room. She'd be out there in the gray half-dark, working through her gear with the methodical quiet of someone who didn't need to perform effort for an audience. Nobody said much about it. They didn't say much about her at all, which was its own kind of statement. The team designation was Bravo 7, assigned to 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, and they had been together long enough that the friction between them had settled into something like routine. 8 operators, 1 team sergeant named Decker, and a commanding officer, Major Callum Tate, who ran the unit the way a man runs something he built himself and intends to keep running until it dies, or he does. Cross had been attached to the team 14 months earlier, following a deployment with 1st Marine Division, where she'd served as a designated marksman with an infantry battalion out of Camp Pendleton. Her record was spotless, actually. Expert rifle, expert pistol, qualified on the M1 semi-automatic sniper system, the M4 EOA6 bolt action. And this was the part that made people look twice. She'd completed the Scout Sniper Basic course at Quantico with the 3rd highest final score in the program's recent history, 3rd highest. Out of a class of 26, all of whom were male, most of whom had been shooting since before they could drive. Decker had handed her the assignment packet without much ceremony. She'd taken it without much response. That was how it started. She was 31. She'd grown up in Flagstaff, Arizona, with a father who was a retired gunnery sergeant and a mother who'd spent 12 years as a Navy corpsman before a knee injury forced her out. The Crosses were a military family the way some families are a church family. It wasn't a decision so much as a given. Lena had enlisted at 19, done her initial infantry training, back when women were still officially restricted from infantry billets, found a workaround through administrative reassignment that her father had quietly arranged, and spent the next decade getting progressively better at a very specific set of skills that most people preferred not to think about in detail. She didn't talk about her record. She didn't frame her scores or print out her qual sheets. When new team members rotated in and inevitably ran a background check on her out of some combination of professional curiosity and mild suspicion, they found the numbers and usually didn't know what to do with them. The scores were too good. Numbers like that didn't look like a woman in her early 30s. They looked like someone who'd been doing this since childhood, which, in a way, she had. What she found in those first months with Bravo 7 was that numbers didn't move people the way you'd think. You'd expect a man who'd seen the qual sheets to adjust his behavior accordingly, to update his mental model. But people don't work like that. People keep the mental model and find reasons to dismiss the data. It was Sergeant First Class Rourke who said it most clearly. Not to her face, but loud enough that she was meant to hear it. They were running a vehicle exfil drill 2 miles outside the wire, and Cross had just put 3 consecutive shots into a steel target at 800 meters while the wind was doing something unreasonable off the hillside. She'd heard Rourke behind her, talking to Corporal Metz, his voice pitched at that particular volume men use when they want to communicate to a woman that they're being discussed. Luck, Rourke had said, watch her try that again. She'd tried it again. 3 more shots. Same result. Rourke hadn't said anything after that, but the silence wasn't agreement. It was recalibration. He was moving the goalposts somewhere she couldn't see yet, looking for a different version of doubt that would hold. Major Tate had called her into his office on a Tuesday in March, 6 months into her time with the team. She sat across the desk from him, and he looked at her the way commanding officers look at something they haven't fully decided what to do with yet. "Cross," he said, "what's your read on the Yazid problem?" The Yazid problem was what the battalion was calling a HVT, high-value target, a mid-level logistics coordinator for a weapons smuggling network operating through 3 provinces. He wasn't flashy. He didn't show up on CNN. He moved money and materiel, and the intelligence picture suggested he was about to move both in significant quantities toward a coalitional supply route that the battalion had operational responsibility for. Cross had been reading the intelligence summaries the same way she read everything, carefully and more than once. She had noticed something the analysts had flagged but not emphasized. Yazid's pattern of movement suggested he was using a second site in addition to the known safe house, and the timing of his appearances at that second site lined up with a local market day. In the village of Kaharim, he wasn't going to the market. He was using the foot traffic as cover for a handoff. She told Tate this. He listened without writing anything down. When she finished, he nodded once and said, "Pull together a brief. 20 minutes, tomorrow, 0800. She pulled the brief. The next morning, she stood in front of the team, all 8 of them, plus Tate and the battalion S2 captain, and walked through the pattern analysis with a regional map, 2 satellite imagery overlays, and a timeline of Yazid's confirmed movements over 4 months. The S2 captain interrupted 3 times with questions, each of which she answered with a specific reference to the imagery or the signals intelligence. The team was quiet throughout. When she finished, Rourke had his arms crossed. He looked at Tate and said, "Where'd this come from?" Tate had said Cross. Rourke had looked at her then, not with hostility exactly, more with the expression of a man being asked to accept something that didn't fit the story he was telling himself. The operation order came down 11 days later. Bravo 7 would conduct a direct action raid on the secondary site during the next market day window. 14 days out. The objective was capture, not kill. Intel wanted Yazid breathing and coherent. Cross was assigned as Overwatch. It was the right call and she knew it. She also knew that Overwatch was the assignment they gave to the most reliable shooter on the team. But it was also the assignment farthest from the action, the one that gave you the best view of everything and the least opportunity to demonstrate anything that changed how people saw you. She'd been in Overwatch before. It was where they put her consistently, and she'd spent enough time thinking about that to have decided she was done thinking about it. She set up her position on the roof of an abandoned agricultural building 620 meters from the objective, northeast corner, with Corporal Finch as her spotter. Finch was 24 and had been with the team 7 months. He was thorough, had good eyes, and didn't fill silence with noise. She appreciated that about him. Most people filled silence with noise. They were in position 4 hours before the breach team moved up. Cross went through her mental checklist the way she always did, not because she needed the checklist at that point, but because the checklist was a rhythm, and rhythm was what kept you level when the body started running chemistry you hadn't asked for. Range to objective, 618 meters. Wind, 7 knots, northeast, consistent. Temperature, 91 degrees, dropping. Light, adequate, direct sun at angle. Shadows pooling at the northeast corner of the courtyard. Hazard, a civilian vehicle parked along the south wall that hadn't been there in the pre-mission imagery. She noted the vehicle to Finch. Finch relayed it to Decker on the team net. Decker acknowledged. The breach team moved at 13:47 local time. What happened in the first 4 minutes of the raid went approximately as planned. The breach team hit the door, moved through the entry room, found 2 armed men in the interior courtyard, and put both of them down without taking casualties. Yazid was located in the rear room, which was where the pattern analysis had suggested he'd be. Then the vehicle on the south wall turned out not to be empty. Cross had been watching it since they moved. When the door opened and 2 men stepped out with AKs, she had maybe 2 seconds of processing time before the decision was made for her by the mathematics of the situation. The men were moving toward the breach team's exposed left flank. The breach team was occupied with Yazid and hadn't seen them come out. 2 packs, south wall, armed, she said into the radio. Moving to your 9. Decker's voice. Engaged inside. Cross, can you? She was already adjusting. First shot, 618 meters, crosswind 7 knots, the first man at the vehicle. He went down before he'd covered 4 meters. Second shot, she was cycling the bolt before the first man hit the ground. The second man had turned at the sound, which moved him out of her original firing solution by about 2 degrees, which she'd already accounted for. He went down 2 seconds after the first. Total elapsed time from the first man stepping out of the vehicle, 6 seconds. Decker's voice again, different this time. Cross, confirm, 2 packs, south wall, neutralized. Silence on the net for a moment. Then, Finch beside her, not on the radio, just under his breath. Jesus. She reacquired the objective and kept watching. That was the job. The moment you started thinking about what you'd just done was the moment you stopped watching, and stopping watching was what got people killed. Yazid was in flex cuffs and moving toward the exfil vehicle Within 6 minutes, the breach team was out of the building in 8. Total contact time, 11 minutes. The debrief happened at 2100 that night in the operations tent. 8 operators, Tate, the S2 captain, and a sergeant major from higher headquarters who'd been observing the operation. For reasons Cross had not been briefed on, Tate walked through the timeline. When he got to the vehicle contact at 1351, he stopped and looked at the team. 2 armed combatants exited a vehicle on the south wall, he said. They were moving to engage the breach team's exposed flank. They were neutralized at distance. 6 seconds, 2 shots, crosswind, 618 meters. He paused. Cross. She didn't say anything. She'd learned a long time ago that the right response to being named in a debrief was to listen until there was a question. Rourke was sitting 2 seats to her left. She could see him in her peripheral vision. He was looking at the map board, not at her, which was different from his usual way of looking at nothing in particular when he was deciding whether to believe something. The sergeant major from higher headquarters, his name tape read Holbrook, leaned forward and looked down the table at her. Staff Sergeant Cross, he said. Sergeant Major. How long have you been with this team? 14 months, Sergeant Major. He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they're not really responding to what you said but to what they're thinking. Then he looked at Tate. Major, Holbrook said. Can I ask what Cross's current role designation is? Tate said Overwatch element. Holbrook said, has she been evaluated for a primary shooter slot? The tent was quiet in a way that tents don't usually get quiet. It was the specific silence of a question that changes the air in a room. Tate said, she's been utilized as Overwatch. That's not what I asked. Tate said nothing for a moment. Then, no, Sergeant Major, she hasn't. Holbrook leaned back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He said one thing, and he said it in the same flat, informational tone a man uses when he's stating something he expects everyone in the room to write down and remember. Then fix that, he said. Rourke caught up with her outside the operations tent at 21:30. The phobe was quiet, that particular quiet of a post-operation night when the adrenaline's burned off, and what's left is mostly exhaustion and something you don't have a name for. Cross, he said. She stopped walking. He stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance rather than at her. She'd noticed that about him. He was a man who found it difficult to look directly at something he was in the process of reconsidering. The vehicle, he said. The south wall. I didn't see them come out. I know. I should have been watching that side. You were on the breach. I know. He was quiet for a moment. 6 seconds. She didn't say anything. I've been on 3 combat deployments, Rourke said. I've been shooting since I was 12 years old, and I don't know if I make that shot in 6 seconds in those conditions. He finally looked at her. I think I make one of them. Maybe. Not both, she said. You would have found a way. He shook his head. Don't do that. Don't make it easier than it is. He looked back at the middle distance. I was wrong about you, early on. I had a picture of what you were and I kept it because it was easier than the alternative. She said, I know. I'm telling you I know that I was wrong. I heard you. He nodded. He seemed like he had more to say and had decided against it. He turned and walked back toward the barracks. She stood outside the operations tent for a while after that. The stars over the fob were very clear. She thought about her father, who had told her once that the way you know you've gotten somewhere is when the people who were wrong about you stop trying to explain why they weren't. That Rourke hadn't tried to explain anything, that he'd just said what he said and gone quiet. Felt like something, though she didn't have the right word for it. The tasking change came through 2 weeks later. Tate called her in again. This time he didn't look like a man deciding what to do with something. He looked like a man who'd made a decision and was now delivering it. Primary shooter, he said. Effective immediately. You'll work with Finch as your designated spotter going forward. Primary responsibility for all long-distance fire support requirements for Bravo 7. It means more planning load, more pre-mission prep, and you brief your own Overwatch plans to me directly, she said. Understood, sir. This isn't a reward, he said. This is a correction. She looked at him steadily. I know the difference, sir. Something shifted in his expression. He nodded. One more thing, he said, the sergeant major. Holbrook, he served with your father at Pendleton. Did you know that? She hadn't. She said so. Tate said, he didn't know you were on my team until he saw the operation order 2 days before the mission. When he saw your name, he didn't say anything to me. He just observed. He paused. He wasn't doing your father a favor. I want to be clear about that. What he said in that debrief, he said because of what you did. The numbers, the pattern analysis, the south wall. She thought about that. I appreciate you telling me, sir. I'm telling you because the team needs to hear it at some point, and I wanted you to decide how that information lands. It's your record. What you do with people knowing about it is up to you, she told Finch first. Not all of it, just that she'd been moved to primary shooter and that he'd be her full-time spotter going forward. He'd looked at her with an expression that was almost comic in its transparency, like a 24-year-old who'd just been told he was getting something he'd wanted but hadn't let himself want too loudly. Yes, ma'am, he'd said. She'd told him not to call her ma'am. He'd said, yes, Staff Sergeant Cross. She'd told him that too much. He'd said Cross and looked slightly mortified, and she'd let it go at that. The team absorbed the change, the way teams absorb things, without announcement, through behavior. The first time they ran a fire support coordination drill after the tasking change, she briefed her Overwatch plan to the whole team, and nobody asked Decker to confirm it or looked at Tate to verify that what she'd said was correct. They looked at the map, and they looked at her, and they asked questions that were about the plan, not about the source of the plan. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that only looks small from the outside. The second operation came in late April, 23 days after the first. Different target package, different province, higher threat environment. The intelligence suggested a more hardened site with exterior security posting and a secondary team that could respond within 8 minutes from a position to the north. Cross had been part of the planning cell for this one from the initial targeting meeting. She'd sat at the table where 4 months earlier she'd been a name on a subordinate roster, and she'd put her analysis up alongside the S2 captains and Deckers, and Tate had integrated all three without hierarchy, going to whichever one had the clearest answer to whichever question was on the table. That was new. That mattered. Her Overwatch position for the second operation was 740 meters from the objective, elevated, with a partial sightline into the interior courtyard that Finch had identified during imagery analysis. The partial sightline was a problem they'd spent 2 days solving, eventually determining that a 3-meter lateral shift from the obvious position would open the angle by 11 degrees. Enough. Finch had found that. She'd made a point of saying so in the planning brief. The operation ran cleaner than the first one. No surprises from parked vehicles. The breach team made entry on time, the target was located where the intelligence said he'd be, and the exterior security posts were handled by a secondary element that moved on Tate's command with no contact required from Overwatch. She'd sat behind the rifle for 4 hours and fired 0 shots. It was, in its way, the best possible outcome. You spend all that preparation so that the preparation becomes unnecessary. She'd learned that from her father, who'd said it to her when she was 16 and had just spent 3 months building up to a rifle competition, only to shoot clean on the first day and have nothing left to prove on the second. The goal, he'd told her, is to make the hardest thing look like nothing happened. On the flight back to the FOB, Rourke was sitting across from her in the transport, and at some point above the desert, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, without preamble, "You know Metz thought you got lucky on the south wall?" She said, "No. He doesn't think that anymore." She said, "I know." Rourke looked at her for a moment. "Does it bother you that it took this long?" She thought about it honestly, because the honest answer was more complicated than either yes or no. "It used to," she said. "There was a period where I thought if I just kept performing at a certain level, eventually the math would be undeniable. That people would have to update." She looked out the small porthole window at the dark below. "But it doesn't work like math. People don't update from data. They update from moments, from one specific thing that cuts through." She paused. "The south wall was a moment," Rourke said. "For what it's worth, you were already the best shot on this team before the south wall." "I know that too," she said. "But you didn't." He was quiet for a while after that. 3 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in July, Sergeant Major Holbrook was back at the FOB for a command inspection. Cross passed him in the corridor outside the operations center, and he stopped her with a nod and said, simply, "Staff Sergeant." She said, "Sergeant Major." He looked at her with the particular appraisal of a man who'd been watching something develop from a distance and had just gotten close enough to see the details. He had 30 years in his face, and he wore them plainly, the way career enlisted do when they stop caring what the wearing looks like. "I knew your father," he said. "Yes, sir. Major Tate told me. Your father was one of the best I've seen at what he did," Holbrook said. I worked with him for 2 years. I know exactly how good that is. He paused. You're better. She didn't know what to say to that in a way that wasn't either false modesty or something that sounded like agreement with a compliment. So she said the only thing that was simply true. He'd argue that, Sergeant Major. Something in Holbrook's expression shifted. A brief recalibration, like a smile that didn't quite surface. Yeah, he said. He would. He nodded once more and walked on. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he'd gone, the afternoon light coming through the far window in a long slant across the concrete floor. She thought about her father, who was 61 years old now and still went to the range on Saturdays in Flagstaff because he said it kept him honest. She thought about the south wall and the 6 seconds and the silence in the debrief tent after Holbrook had said what he said. She thought about Rourke outside the operations tent saying, I think I make one of them. Maybe. Not both. She thought about 14 months of arriving first to the range in the gray half-dark, of running her bore brush through the barrel while nobody else was watching, of making the hard thing look like nothing happened. Then she turned and walked back toward the operations center, because there was a planning meeting at 1600, and she had a briefing to build.